So firstly, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's the Saltire Society launch of Ploughing the City, Art and Public Space in a Future Scotland by Sorcha Carey and Ruth Ewan. I'm Sarah Mason, I'm the director of the Saltire Society. I'll just give you a short audio description. So I'm a white woman with short pink hair, I'm wearing a dark green dress, and there's a cream wall behind me with some old film cuttings in frames. Ploughing the City is the 14th pamphlet of the Saltire Society series. In the series, we invite individuals to spark fresh thinking, ignite debate, and challenge our orthodoxies through the publication of commissioned essays. Ploughing the City examines how our cities look, work, and evolve through the lens of public art and creativity. Sorcha and Ruth reflect on how public art is engaged with and discuss how things could and should change for a better Scotland. To have our civic spaces reflect the people and our culture. The pandemic and recent global demonstrations have focused our minds and lifted a mirror to the art that sits within our everyday, making question, what does that art really say about us and about Scotland? This afternoon, we'll see a short discussion on the themes within the pamphlet. If you have any questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen is a little Q&A box. If you pop your question in there, the panel will answer as many as we can at the end of the discussion. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel of speakers this afternoon. Our authors of Ploughing the City, Glasgow-based artist Ruth Ewan, who works concept-specific research resulting in a variety of forms, including performance, writing, and print. Director of Edinburgh Arts Festival, Sorcha Carey. And our authors will be in conversation with researcher, writer, and Glasgow-based artist Hussein Metha. Welcome to our panel. We look forward to the conversation.
Shall I begin?
Thank you, Sarah. Do you want to introduce yourself, Ruth?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Ewan. As Sarah said, I'm an artist based in Glasgow. To give you an audio description, I'm a middle-aged white woman wearing glasses, sitting in front of some bookshelves with a couple of objects and plants on them.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sorcha Carey. I'm the director of Edinburgh Art Festival, and I am a white woman with shoulder-length light brown hair, wearing a blue and white shirt and a pink flower to match Sarah's hair, in front of a wall of books in an office with a very bad Wi-Fi connection. So I'm actually joining from my phone. And over to Hussein.
Hi everyone, I'm Hussein, an artist and writer based in Glasgow, where I am currently wearing a red velvet shirt, a hat, and behind me is a bookcase and a tree.
So Hussein, thank you so much for becoming an extra voice in the conversation that Ruth and I initiated. I think it was sort of almost 9 months ago, wasn't it, Ruth, that we first started the conversation after the very, very kind invitation from the Saltire Society to me to think about having a conversation about public space and taking the opportunity to reflect on our changing relationships to public space and public art as a result of the pandemic. Ruth, you were immediately a kind of the natural choice for me to sort of approach in terms of conversation, because not only have we worked together on several occasions, and we were privileged to have a new work by you in the Sympathetic Magic in the festival a number of years ago, but also you're an artist whose entire practice has been very rooted in working it both within the context of public space and the infrastructures of public space, as much as thinking about the potential for presenting artwork in a public forum.
Yeah, and so yeah, I think it was quite an easy conversation to have in lots of ways, and I think it could have been a lot longer. I think we touched on a lot of things that we could have delved into given the opportunity again. And it felt, revisiting the text, which I think we finished back in February, it feels like the world's moved on again since then, and it also felt natural to me to invite Hussein into the conversation, because during lockdown, we'd had a walk together. It was in the winter. I remember it being very icy and slippy. And we spoke a lot about public space. We went to the park, and you were telling me, Hussein, about the article that you'd written in the Druth about monuments. And so I feel like that conversation informed my text with you a bit, Sorcha. So yeah, it felt like a natural fit. I'm going to start sharing some images, and I will describe them as I go. So I want to start off with the cover, which I think is rather lovely, of the booklet, fits in with the Saltire series. And I should say that the title, Ploughing the City, will explain the choice of title later, but it references a quote by Frederick Douglass. Can everyone just give me a thumbs up if you can all see those images? Okay, I can only see a couple of people. Okay, good. So, you know, like almost everyone who wasn't working, you know, in essential healthcare jobs, I found myself at home under lockdown, seeing a lot of public spaces that we were familiar with in our local communities changing, and perceptions of those spaces changing. Early on in the lockdown, I think it's fair to say globally, children's playgrounds were off limits for a period. My own children were very mournful of this and started treating the city in itself as a playground, and they still do. In fact, we've yet to come out of that phase, I think. We also saw, well, Sorcha and I, early on when we spoke about what was changing for us, we spoke about this, what felt like a collective reawakening of noticing nature, as many of us had, well, if we had the luxury of having a garden or even a balcony or a window box space, but also a reawakening and an interest in our parks, our communal spaces, and a sort of witnessing of nature really taking over. This is an image of Wishaw in Scotland, where deer were observed coming into housing estate. As the roads became quieter, a lot more animals started coming into our cities, and I think there was a massive surge in activities like bird watching, and I think noise also became much more, like the sound of nature became much more present, as there was less traffic on the road and less planes in the sky.
And I think we also felt, we also all felt that we needed that contact, didn't we? We were being separated from some of the public spaces and the kind of normal habits of life of, restricting when we could go for a walk, or, when we could go into a park, or for those of us who didn't have gardens. So somehow that need to, and that kind of search for nature became so much more urgent as well.
Yeah, totally. And I think, Sorcha, you mentioned in the pamphlet this idea of the 15-minute city, which is like, I felt like we all became quite, embedded in our very local habitat in a sense, but that was also linked to, this search for green spaces for those of us who didn't have any, or, wondering how we could improve our immediate locale for the community.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that sense, I suppose for so many people who might have a job that involves them leaving the house early in the morning and coming back late in the evening, that somehow everyone was living in or not everyone, but a lot of people who were working from home were living in a different way, and having that opportunity to kind of re-engage with the immediate kind of locale in which they live.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this image is sunflowers that I grew in my backyard last year, and you can see there's a shared lane space just behind where I live, and one of the activities that I took part in was clearing that with neighbours. And I guess as neighbours, it was already a very strong sense of community where I live on the south side of Glasgow, but I have to say that massively increased through lockdown. I guess one of the things, as well as this, what I think we could draw as a sort of positive note, noticing nature and appreciating our communities and getting to know our neighbours. There was also one of the first things we spoke about was this sort of shift in public perception, and what I described in the booklet as what you could see as a shift in the Overton window within public spaces, and the debates around decolonising our city's monuments have been, catapulted into the mainstream, and that's something that we talk about in the pamphlet. Do you want to talk about this image, Sorcha?
Yeah, I very much wanted to share this image and share the image in the pamphlet as well, because it seems to me as an artwork to make visible some of the things that we were experiencing and responding to in the pandemic. This is an artwork by an Edinburgh-based artist called Jonathan Owen, and Jonathan works with primarily with sculpture, and he has an amazing practice where he will take historic sculptures and recarve them and kind of release these sort of new works out of historic works that he has acquired at auction. But he also, prior to making those sculptures, he started off by taking photographs actually and making what he calls eraser drawings, where he very painstakingly erases elements of a photograph to create a new image. And what you're seeing here is one of his very early eraser drawings, where he came across a book of public sculpture, and he started making eraser drawings where he erased the majority of the sculpture, so that you, in this particular image, you see just these kind of suggestive hands that kind of become the trace of a sculpture that was there. And it seemed to me to speak in a very compelling way of the way in which, prior to the pandemic, our cities are very, very populated by these relics of a primarily Victorian, some earlier, but a very Victorian configuration of public space, which is very much focused on honouring particular individuals, a very kind of patriarchal approach, and of course, some incredibly problematic histories that sort of behind those many of those statues, but somehow those statues had been invisible, I think, to many of us in the day-to-day. And I don't know, Hussein, if you would like to come in there, because I know you were touching on that in that wonderful piece you wrote for the Druth on monuments and public space.
Yeah, and I think for me it was the initial period of the pandemic when cities were, noticeably different for the first time. I think that really heightened an awareness and a fascination for me about a recurring theme in my research, which is the 19th century, and thinking about how, we take for granted almost the complexion of our cities, what makes them up, the kind of homogeneous style of monuments that you see in the city, but wanting to look at that not as something that was just natural, but aiming to denaturalize that, or see that it was founded within a particular time frame, within a particular conception, and looking at the role that those monuments play. But there's an academic in Edinburgh called Liz Stanley who talks about the way that monuments within cities are both, hyper visible, but also strangely invisible and strangely unseen, because they, due to their sheer kind of homogeneity, they're not really, you can't really always look at a statue of Queen Victoria or Dundas or any one of these 19th century figures. You can't look at that analytically all the time, but somehow when the cities were emptied, you could begin to question what those things really were. And I think during the period of June, July last year, when the Black Lives Matter uprisings happened, especially in America, where they were taking down both Confederate monuments and colonial monuments, interestingly, people began to realize that these things which seemed so permanent and so fixed were actually quite fragile and quite easy to take down, which is also, you know, quite fascinating, because it's sort of a metaphor for how authority and power is also potentially quite fragile at the same time as being seen as permanent and homogenous. So yeah, for me, this artwork is really, you know, kind of exemplifies that point of the invisibility of the 19th century colonial monument, but also the way it does shape space and make the city visible, as it were. But yeah, for me also, it was just so much of the experience of living in the city was founded on kind of 19th century forms and conceptions, which to us are, I think, quite invisible. But in that piece, I also discussed just the form of the restaurant, which was so ubiquitous and so normalized, but actually looking at it where those who are serving and working in hospitality wear masks and the patrons don't, it becomes more visibly a sign of class domination as well. So yeah, I think the pandemic really, for me, allowed me to see things more clearly about the 19th century cities that we all inhabit.
And I think that was very much a collective experience, wasn't it? That, yeah.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And I read something interesting about Edinburgh, and it's something that's quoted in the booklet, is that the sort of monuments of the new town in Edinburgh could be seen as an object lesson in patriarchal power. And a lot of my work has looked at historic monuments, but also the way that people have used those monuments as active sites of resistance within their cities. And this is an image of, it's a statue of the Prime Minister William Gladstone that's located in Bow in East London. And it's an image that I took during a walking tour that I led with the feminist historian Sheila Robotham around women's history in the East End. And this statue, so the image shows Gladstone holding out his bronze hand, and his bronze hand is daubed with red paint. And for me, this is actually a really beautiful work of public art, not the statue of Gladstone, but the red hand, because over decades, the people in East London have continually refreshed the paint. And when you go past it, it's often a different shade of red. And it's this idea that it's living in the community's memory, that they did not want the statue to be erected. And it was in fact paid for by docking the wages of the female workers, the women and children who were working in Brian and May Match Factory around the corner, which is now luxury flats around the corner from this statue. And I think that's just such a powerful image, that red hand. And of course, it resonated so much with all the actions we've seen against our city's monuments over the last year.
Yeah, it's something we touched on a lot in our conversation, isn't it, Ruth, at the time? And I still feel is so important to reflect on, which is that way in which, you know, our cities are shaped and inhabited by these very kind of permanent legacies from previous ages and histories. And I think Hussein has kind of summarized that very, very, very beautifully, actually, in your Druth article, but also just now. But how can we find ways to kind of activate that conversation? The Gladstone statue is such a compelling kind of example of that, of even prior to the pandemic, a community continuing to have a live public conversation with an element of their immediate neighborhood in a very kind of visibly public way. But it's one of the many ways, I think, that we've seen communities and individuals responding to some of these kind of more permanent markers that are left in our city from previous generations.
Yeah, and interesting to hear you talk, Ruth, about how you thought that's a beautiful piece of public art, because even that, the kind of chromatic juxtaposition of the red on the black that is now so familiar. I mean, I was looking last week at these statues of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth II that were toppled in Vancouver, BC. And it's just, it's something that actually weirdly brings the statues to life, like animates them as figures of enmity. But also, yeah, it's quite weirdly, bizarrely beautiful to see these defaced and kind of chromatically altered statues, given that they're predominantly either white marble or, you know, this kind of bronze black.
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings out this, in the conversation we touched on, you know, ideas around permanence versus the ephemeral in the public realm, and what, you know, what it means to place an object permanently in public space, and the sort of audacity of doing that, and the actual arrogance of doing that, and presuming that something is even permanent in the first place and that it's not really fluid. And that's something with I grapple with that a lot in my own work anyway, and the idea of things kind of escaping from you and then wanting to pull them back in. And there was a story that the playwright John McCann told me a couple of months ago about Frederick Douglass. During his tour around Scotland, he was an advocate for the Send the Money Back campaign when the Free Church had accepted money from plantation owners. And there was a mass campaign in Scotland to send this money back. And the words "send the money back" appeared again and again as graffiti. Some women even cut it out of turf, I think, on the side of Salisbury Crags. There was a lot of really creative activism going on that isn't necessarily what we think about at that time. And someone had scratched into a wall in Arbroath. Someone had graffitied "send the money back." And a member of the town council asked for it to be removed. And the person who went to clean it, instead of cleaning it off, they scratched it into the stone. And I think that's so profound when we think about, we think about these sort of ephemeral banners and how this can live on now, how this moment can be retained in public consciousness, I think is so important. So I didn't actually describe the image, I realized that. So this is the plinth of the Colston monument in Bristol after it was toppled. And it's surrounded by Black Lives Matter handmade placards made out of cardboard. I've included a number of quotes in the images here. This is a quote from the anti-racist activist Roger Huddle, who was one of the people who founded Rock Against Racism. He said, "These monuments are tombstones under which our real history and its victims are buried. The monuments of empire must fall."
And I think that's been one of the most compelling sort of experiences of the past year, is the way in which we've not just reassessed the kind of the physical objects that kind of really dominate our city, but also really begun to understand that, as Hussein was referencing earlier, that history isn't a monolithic thing or a form that kind of exists externally from us, but it's something that is created and crafted with very specific agendas. And, even in the instance of the Colston statue, learning that was a statue that was actually erected many, many, many years and generations after that particular individual even lived. And I understand, I think Ruth and I, we joined a seminar where we heard the mayor of Bristol speaking incredibly powerfully actually about the experience of that within the city, and noting that even at the time of the proposal to erect that monument, I think, 50 or so years after he had died, there was resistance to erecting a monument to him then.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same with the Melville monument in Edinburgh that we're showing now, showing the Viscount Melville, Henry Dundas, who's at the time referred to as the eagle on his perch. And there was opposition at the time to that statue being erected. And obviously a lot more opposition to it now. It's really been the focal point for the Black Lives Matter movement in Edinburgh. And the image shows the monument, you can see it, the scale of it is immense. I don't know the exact height, perhaps you do, Sorcha, but it's absolutely huge. I think it's is it the highest structure in central Edinburgh? I might be wrong.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But you can see a council worker at the bottom of the monument clearing off the graffiti. And from what I can see, it's the name George Floyd sprayed repeatedly over the bottom of the stonework there.
Yeah, it's also an interesting question because, I mean, people should know about Dundas, and perhaps having the monument stand, but with information about, or like a critical history of Dundas would be interesting, because his legacy, some people attribute the abolition of slavery partly to Dundas, whereas that's just fake if you look at his role in the Haitian Revolution in particular, or why the abolition of slavery actually happened. It had nothing to do with him. So yeah,
I think it raises a really interesting question, isn't it, about how we retain, or how we make sure that we're making space always in the city for a continual contextualization and conversation with monuments, the monuments that we have inherited. But then, of course, for future generations, there will be further ways in which public space has been shaped by their predecessors, and how can we find ways to embed those conversations in our communities and our societies, as well as in and around the kind of physical objects and structures.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was just thinking there when you were talking, Sorcha, about in Delhi, outside of Delhi, there's a massive kind of enclosure with all these colonial monuments, so there's like George V down to like Victoria, and everyone have just been put in this kind of graveyard for monuments. And I was wondering what you both make of that. Like, is that like a sort of theme park of dead white men and stuff? Is that yeah?
Well, I mean, there are many of such graveyards, I think, all across the former Soviet Union also. And I find them really fascinating, because I think obviously they've been taken off their plinths, which of course completely sort of shifts the relationship to the way those monuments were originally designed to function. And I think, as you had kind of already referenced, you're saying, in seeing them all grouped together and kind of corralled into a single space, it also makes really visible the universality of a particular form of language. By seeing them all side by side, that it takes away that sort of sense of an individual power, and can reduce a representation to the kind of visual trope and the kind of many other similar monuments that particular visual form is quoting.
Yeah, totally. And it's also, to see that kind of ruinous landscape is reminiscent of the kind of what's at play in that poem Ozymandias, which is it a Shelley poem about Ramesses II, and about how his how his once powerful empire is now crumbled into the dust.
We also we talked a lot. We didn't include it in our final pamphlet, did we, Ruth? But we did talk a little bit about Oscar Wilde's tale, the Happy Prince, as well. There's one of the Oscar Wilde fairy tales, which is of a statue that is sort of isolated up on a very tall column of a former prince, and he gifts all the jewels from his representation to this little bird, to help a young boy that he can see in the city who's starving. So that every day a little bird will come and pick out one of his ruby eyes and deliver it to a poor family. But it's a very interesting story written from the perspective of one of these monuments being slowly taken to pieces.
Yeah, it's very beautiful, that story. As the monument sees sort of impoverished city around him and sees different instances going on. And I think the final one is a struggling writer who has to deliver, or is the starving writer who needs to buy food, otherwise he can't finish his play. And he gives the final piece of himself to him. Now I thought maybe it's time for us to move on to some more kind of inspiring activities that have come out of recent times in our cities in Scotland. And Hussein, do you want to talk a bit about this image here?
Yeah, so I think we were talking when we were planning this talk is about this kind of contestation of public space within the city, but this struck me as a really good example of where both Ruth and I live in Glasgow, although not south side. It was a piece of vacant land in Mary Hill, and the kind of led by the tenants of that tower block that you see on the left-hand side of the image. Glasgow City Council were going to put this piece of land up for sale for exclusively for private ownership, for development, and the tenants union organised with Living Rent, which is the tenants union, to take back this land that's in their locale, in their vicinity. And they built a bothy on the land, they built a community garden. Now they use the land for organising with young people around COP26, which is coming to the city. It's really become, from speaking to, I know a couple of people who've been organising it, and from speaking to them, it's become a real focal point for the community, but allowed, everyone to, in fact, realise what is possible and who has the right to this land, really. I mean, within the structures of capital and, the city's status quo, people might not have felt so much so that they could have claimed this land. But I think the pandemic really, going back to that idea that Sorcha was talking about in the pamphlet of the 15-minute city, thinking about the immediate locale within 15 minutes. Well, it was literally the tenants of that tower block in the left-hand corner of this image that really kind of claimed this land. And now the ball's really in the court of Glasgow City Council, but it makes it seem less likely that they could just sell this land to developers. And it's really been used by the community for all sorts of things. I think they had one kind of open day where they had food and performances, and they're using it to organize around COP26, which is going to make, again, that's I'm really hopeful that COP26 will be a time for kind of eco-socialism to really come to the fore within Glasgow and in a way transform our city as well. But I just thought it was so inspiring to watch this campaign. And again, the focus on a community garden, I think, is so key because, as Ruth gestured towards earlier, those people who are lucky enough to have a garden have really managed to use it in lockdown. But just the joy of being able to grow something and eat it and share it, I think is something that we could all demand, that we could all demand that ability to do that. And yeah, it's just wonderful to see what's going on there. But yeah, I would recommend that everyone check out their Facebook page, and their campaign is called Still Game for the Valley. And I can add in their Facebook group on the chat below.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really inspiring, that initiative. And I also wanted to include an image of just a sort of spontaneous event that took place during, was it December, I think, or was it January? I'm not quite sure. during the winter months. This is from the pond in Queen's Park in Glasgow when it froze over. I think this was the first time it had properly frozen over in a couple of decades, and it attracted a huge number of people. It was on a lot of the front pages of national newspapers the next day as well. And you can see in the center of the image there's a figure skater. So a number of professional skaters came in, and it created this amazing spectacle, but also this sense of sort of collective joy was there. There were people playing instruments, there was kids on their sledges, and it was really, really uplifting. You know, in that massive, dark, long winter that we all had, it was incredible to see people coming together and actually enjoying public space in that way. And a lot of people, it was very busy, and most people were wearing masks and so on. But I think after a couple of days, the council realised that perhaps this was a health risk, or they were concerned someone was going to injure themselves. And during the night, the middle of the night, they actually cut the ice. They cut right around it. But then I think it got so cold again, it froze again. So they actually made it more dangerous. This is a quote that features in the booklet. I think you wanted to talk a bit about Patrick Geddes, Kakari.
Yeah, I think I wanted to talk a little bit about Geddes and also this project, which in some ways I think picks up on some of the more impromptu actions and responses and kind of appropriation of space that you and Hussein have been referencing in the previous image. So we're looking at an image of an artwork which is called the Palm House, and it was made by Bobby Niven, who is one of the founders of the Bothy project. And we commissioned this work for the festival in 2017 when we were making a program which was exploring the ideas of Patrick Geddes, who the very, very inspirational town planner, but also community activist who worked with communities across the old town of Edinburgh at the end of the 19th century when the old town was one of the worst slums in Europe, and worked with communities to find simple ways to kind of improve the living conditions that they were living in, sort of painting a wall white in a close to bring in more sunlight, but also looking at some of the abandoned sites in the city and turning them into community gardens. So the site of Bobby's artwork, the Palm House, is in a site which is now called the Johnston Terrace Wildlife Trust, but it's one of the smallest wildlife reserves in Scotland, and it's actually associated with a kind of a historic Geddes garden where there's wonderful historic photos of people digging the ground sort of here. And we worked with Bobby to site the Palm House there. It's a timber frame structure, and it incorporates these carved elements of hands. And Bobby was really interested in the history of palm houses as this, Victorian, architectural form that came very directly out of colonialism and imperialism. And he was really fascinated in the way in which you create a structure which, on the one hand, supports and facilitates growth of a plant form that's not indigenous to the UK, but also at the very same time it restricts it. At a certain point, the palm becomes too tall for the structure that it has been planted within and has to be cut down. So it felt to me like a really interesting kind of context to sort of begin thinking and talking about the role that art and artists can play and the space that they can provide for conversations to happen in public space. The Palm House runs as a resource for communities during the year, but then in the festival, we're always very honoured to be able to open this space up to audiences. So we're showing an image now of a large queue of people sort of snaking through the Johnston Terrace garden, waiting to go into the Palm House. And Ruth, you used it as a site for some of your sympathetic magic performances in 2018.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful venue, and someone who's lived in Edinburgh for a long time, I studied there. I didn't know that this space existed, and I just absolutely love when you find these little glimmers in a city that you don't know that are previously there, and something like a community garden, I think is just, it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful there, and Bobby's structure in itself is just a really lovely venue to be able to realise an artwork in, and a space to be able to invite people into as well. And I really like the way the festival kind of activate it through cooking food and sharing, and putting on these sort of free events as well. I think it's a fantastic use of city space.
It is wonderful and so important, I think, to be able to kind of open up those spaces in our city and to facilitate conversations, I suppose, with both physically with spaces, but also with themes and ideas. And I think it would be really interesting to kind of hear from both Ruth and Hussein as artists, and artists who are very engaged with public space, about your sense of the role and the potential for the artist of making work in that context, because we've had a conversation where we sort of talked a lot around kind of monuments and very public and permanent physical structures that have been commissioned within our city. But there's also really important commissioning work that has happened over the course of the 20th century, where artists have been invited in to spend extended times with communities. I'm thinking about the Artist Placement Group, or the amazing work that David Harding was leading in Glenrothes as the town artist, and the ways in which artists can actually provide space and time and a vision, I suppose, to help a community to have conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we kind of miss a trick really with opportunities for artists, and I think the way that artists are inclined to working now, I think so many artists are really keen to work in a socially engaged way, and would be very keen to have more opportunities where they feel like they have a social function in an environment, and in the way that the Artist Placement Group set out to do. And I am kind of baffled as to why we don't have artists in our schools, and why we don't have artists working more and more in our hospitals. I know that there are some brilliant organisations in Scotland who work with artists in hospitals, but I think that's something that could be a lot more of in our care settings, in our nursery settings, and not necessarily creating, permanent works there, but actually creating, experiences there and sharing knowledge there, perhaps also creating other works. I don't know, but yeah, I think some serious kind of joined up thinking needs to be done there. And I think so many skilled and really talented artists just, they're not able to continue to be artists because those employment opportunities don't exist. So, as well as I think it's absolutely crucial that we retain artists' own individual creative freedom to continue to practice and support their own individual practices. I do think there's space for artists to be working more and more in public sector and private sector too. I think, more of it.
What comes to mind for me was I went to the Liverpool Biennale in 2018, and there was this amazing artwork, which was also a community garden, by an artist called Mohamed Bourouissa, who is a French Algerian artist. But it was this amazing, he'd worked with a local primary school in Toxteth in Liverpool, which Toxteth has a long history of, there were the race riots there, and it's home to the kind of oldest Black community in Britain, like pre-Windrush. And I went to the opening of it as part of the biennial, and it was just this amazing, the kind of like serenity and the way that the kids were using it. And you could tell that the artists and the teachers of the school and everything had really like empowered the kids to transform it into their own space. So Mohamed Bourouissa initially was modeling it on a garden that was one of Frantz Fanon's patients in a hospital in Algiers, who Fanon encouraged this patient to use gardening as a kind of therapy, and to delineate his kind of psychic space through making these kind of structures in the garden. And these kids were doing the same thing, but also just sharing in this ability to grow and construct their own space. And I just thought it was like an amazing project. And that garden is still there. I tried to visit it when things opened up a bit last summer. I went to Liverpool, but the garden itself was closed. But I think it should be reopening soon. It's called Resilience Garden in Toxteth in Liverpool. It's brilliant.
And that reminds me as well of here in Glasgow, the Baltic Street Adventure Playground, which Create originally commissioned with the architecture practice Assemble. And it's incredible. I've taken my kids there a couple of times, but not only is it a playground, but it's a massive community resource. And all through the pandemic, it's been a food bank for people. They provide all kinds of support for the local community. And that's a project that's really become something that started off, as an artist or architect's original kind of seed of an idea that's really taken root and grown within the community to turn into something really valuable.
Yeah, so it's really interesting to reflect on what makes it so challenging to really unlock that potential of artists as a resource for the community as well, in the way that work is being commissioned and presented. And I think we touched on that a little in our conversation in the pamphlet as well, Ruth, but I suppose there's a whole complexity. I think that for me, I feel there are two things. One is that I think when you mention the term public art to people, very often the immediate thought is that it will be a statue on a plinth. And there's still a kind of perhaps less of an understanding about the ways in which artists can and do work in public space. And then, of course, there's also a whole complexity around, I think, the structures that support the commissioning and the realization of art and art practice, and how we can really think about the potential, even in new kind of Scottish government strategies, like things like the Community Empowerment Fund and the new culture strategy that might help us to work with artists in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a sense of expectation from people as well, that you say about people creating something on a plinth. I have in the past, I have actually been told by a member of a community that I should make a bronze statue of two male scientists the moment they first met, shaking hands, and we should put that on a plinth. And that's also why I want to say we don't just need artists in these situations, but we need the whole massive kind of support structure that enables these art projects to happen. The curators and the researchers and the funders, and we need all that infrastructure to be able to communicate the value. Because I think often, it can be misunderstood, or there can be a sense of expectation that's perhaps going in the wrong direction.
We were going to end, I think, with a call to arms for the future, weren't we? A quote
from Arundhati Roy. Should I read that? So this is a quote from Arundhati Roy that I think features in the pamphlet, doesn't it? Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I'm just thinking as well with that, how yeah, the option for us to just go back to normal is actually very real, isn't it? Because like throughout the pandemic and throughout the kind of UK government's constant gaslighting, it's very easy to just slip into that amnesiac position of totally forgetting about this time. But I think, yeah, that's worth remembering that quote.
Hello there, we have a couple of questions from the audience if you're ready for those. I think we've got time maybe just for one or two, but this first one here is from Joe Goldblatt. He's asking why, I think this would be in your opinion, why do we not make a stronger case for the positive connections between public art and public health, social cohesion, safer cities and a more sustainable environment? How do we strengthen this case through the evidence-based research to increase government and private sector funding for public art?
I think it's a very important question. I think we all do have a responsibility collectively to find ways to make the case more strongly. I think it's very interesting that we've been through a long and extended period where the value case for a lot of cultural activity has very much resided in economic benefit. And I think, you know, you've had a range of institutions and organizations that have always been making the case that, you know, festivals or large-scale cultural operations bring important outside investment into local communities, which of course they do, but we also need to urgently make the case for the really critical role that that kind of activity in that space and the contact with creativity and creative ideas, the genuine health benefits that that offers, both at the level of the individual, but also I think at the level of the community. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
I think you're probably most qualified to talk about that, Sorcha. Yeah, I mean, I think what I was talking about earlier about, you know, different contexts in which, you know, creating these different contexts within Society for Artists to Work, I think is so important. And, you know, how we fund those things is another question. But I have to say one of the most like profound experiences I've had as an artist has been working closely with patients in the hospital. And it was through an organisation called Vital Arts that do some really interesting work, very kind of bespoke work, and placing artists in that kind of context. And I think we need to look at models like that really work well and say, okay, well, how can we do this here in Scotland? How can we work in this way and use them as exemplary?
And I think it's also about thinking about new modes of research and ways of researching. I think we live in a society which has privileged numbers and statistics. And of course, in terms of actually, you know, researching and somehow kind of translating the value of that experience into a statistical form that kind of reads through to policymakers and so on is more challenging. But there's really exciting work, I think, now being done with the foundation of the Centre for Cultural Value, and some really interesting research, I think, coming out of there that I hope will also help all of us to reflect on our own individual practice and the contribution that we can make in that way.
Sort of connecting to that, we have another question here. What do you think the ways are post-pandemic to continue local people's engagement with their public art, their public spaces and their civic spaces?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it can't be removed from a kind of political engagement with those spaces in a sense, and that one of the things that I've noticed as a result, you know, as a byproduct of the pandemic, is just that increased politicization of space and the increase. I feel that in Glasgow, especially, this increased people are becoming more politicized, and I think that is empowering, and it just means that there's more at stake about our public space, I think, and trying to cultivate that sense of empowerment and politicization. Is that a word? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there was an interesting article recently in Art Review by someone, I think it was called Dan Hicks, and he wrote about why, I think the article's called why Colston should keep toppling, and how we must keep going and keep pushing and not just lose the momentum, because like you say, there is a danger of things just returning to normal and these conversations getting dropped about our civic spaces. And I think they need to really keep on pushing. But I do think there is a massive sort of reawakening that has taken place, and I really hope that we don't go back from that.
And I think it's really interesting because I realized we didn't in our conversation explain the title of the pamphlet, Ploughing the City, but just hearing Hussein and Ruth reflect on that particular question and the very particular language of cultivation of that builds that connection to the sense that in which we have to break the ground, we have to work the soil in order for life and to flourish, for new things to grow. And the Ploughing the City is taken from a quote by Frederick Douglass, where he is making that point that it's only through breaking things up and through agitation. There's another wonderful Frederick Douglass quote, which is life is agitation and agitation progress. And that through that process of kind of constantly working at it, actually, both physically in the breaking of the soil, in the conversations that were happening, that we can foster new life and new growth and development.
That really is a fantastic metaphor and an excellent idea for us probably to end on, as we're actually past 1 p.m. now. I'll just hand back over to Sarah, who is going to deliver our vote of thanks.
Well, as Heather said, yeah, amazing, stimulating conversation. Thank you so much to Hussein, Ruth and Sorcha. Lots for us still to discuss, take away, and hopefully take forward and kind of improve those public spaces post-pandemic, as they have been in some places during the pandemic. I should mention that you can order your copy of Ploughing the City from the Society's website. Heather's kindly popped a link in the chat, so please do that. We'll hopefully get them posted out to you at the end of the month. And finally, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. If you've not already, please do consider joining the Society as a member. Not only will you have the opportunity to engage with more of our events, awards and our local branches throughout the year, but you'll also be supporting a charity in celebrating and lifting up Scottish imagination. Thank you so much this afternoon, and thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.